Europeans are not a young population as we are frequently told. In most narratives, European ancestry is an orderly affair. There is a familiar sequence: Ice Age hunters, Neolithic farmers, then Indo-European horsemen sweeping across the plains. It is a story that moves forward cleanly, like a parade. Modern Europeans in this version are essentially late arrivals, the descendants of a small band of Homo sapiens who left Africa around 50,000 years ago, surged across Eurasia, met Neanderthals in a single dramatic encounter, and then, like an evolutionary tidal wave, replaced everything else. This narrative treats Europe as a stage, Africa as the origin, and the rest of the world as downstream consequence. But there is a genetic fact hiding in plain sight that makes the whole story wobble. It is not a marginal correction, it is a structural fracture. Somewhere between the carefully drawn pie charts of 3 ancestral populations for Europeans and the polished museum placards explaining modern human origins, an uninvited ancestry walks in and sits down at the table. Basal Eurasian. The Basal Eurasians, first discovered in ancient DNA work led by Harvard University geneticists Iosif Lazaridis and David Reich, are not simply another European ingredient like steppe or hunter-gatherer. They are not a tribe, they are not a culture, they are not even yet a skeleton we can point to with confidence. They are something far more disturbing, a deep lineage, a ghost population, that split from the rest of Eurasian-derived populations before all other Eurasian populations diversified, and crucially, one that appears to carry little to no Neanderthal ancestry compared to others. The implications are almost too large to say in one breath, which might be why the broader public rarely hears them stated plainly. In Europe today, by standard modelling, around 1/4 of ancestry traces back, indirectly but significantly, to this Basal Eurasian lineage via early European farmers who carried about 44% Basal Eurasian. That is the number that should stop the conversation cold. 25%. Not a trace. Not an edge case. Not in the Near East only. A full quarter of European ancestry in some groups is not explained by the simplistic version of out of Africa that dominates popular science storytelling. Southern Europeans especially have the highest levels of early European farmer ancestry, up to 50%, meaning that almost 25% of their ancestry is Basal Eurasian. And that changes everything. It changes what it means to be European genetically. It changes what European history is, in the deepest sense, because it stretches that history backward beyond the 50,000-year hinge point where modern narratives want it to begin. And it forces a confrontation that the field has tried to avoid, that the ancestry of Europeans is not merely a post-50,000-year derivative branch of Africans with a little Neanderthal sprinkled on top. It is in part the product of a much older West Eurasian world, a world that did not begin at 50,000 years ago and cannot be reduced to a single wave of expansion. To understand why Basal Eurasian is so explosive, you have to first understand what it threatens, the central morale of the modern origin story. The widely repeated claim, especially in simplified replacement models, is that Eurasia, before 50,000 years ago, was essentially a graveyard of failed experiments. That early Homo sapiens dispersals out of Africa were unsuccessful, meaning they either died out or left no lasting descendants. Everything that mattered, we are told, happens in the final successful sweep. One great migration, one triumphal spread. But once you accept Basal Eurasian as real, and the genetics strongly suggest it is, you are forced to accept something else. Eurasia did not reset itself at 50,000 years. The Basal Eurasian lineage is positioned in the phylogenetic tree like a trapdoor. It sits below or beside the main diversification of Eurasian-derived populations. It implies that at least one major branch of human ancestry existed outside Africa long enough to diverge deeply from later Eurasians, and yet survived long enough to feed ancestry into the Near East, and then, via farming expansions, into Europe. If that is true, then you are no longer telling a story of one migration. You are telling a story of long-term population structure, of ancient Eurasian lineages, refugia, and networks. In other words, you are talking about a Eurasian metapopulation with real continuity and deep time depth. This is why the discovery has remained politically and psychologically difficult. It is easier to treat Basal Eurasian as a minor technicality inside the Near Eastern farmer package. It is easier to bury it behind academic language, ghost population, basal component, deep lineage. It is easier to leave it out of documentaries altogether. Because if you bring it forward, if you say it plainly, it forces the entire modern human origin story to become complicated again. Yet Basal Eurasian refuses to stay buried. It matters because it does something no other ancestry component does. It dilutes Neanderthal ancestry. Neanderthal DNA has become the symbolic signature of being Eurasian. It's the easy talking point. Non-Africans have 2% Neanderthal ancestry. People love it because it turns deep prehistory into identity. It is a badge, a meme, a narrative hook. But Basal Eurasian ancestry interferes with this picture like a contaminant in a lab assay. Since Basal Eurasians carried little or no Neanderthal admixture, and if modern Europeans carry a quarter of their ancestry from Basal Eurasian-derived farmers, then Europeans are not 2% Neanderthal because that's what happened. They are 2% Neanderthal because later mixtures diluted deeper ancestry signals. This is a profound difference. It means the familiar figure of Neanderthal percent is not a direct historical readout. It is a blurred photograph. Also, we will not use the term non-Africans. Non-African is like describing all animals as non-birds. It makes no sense. The term looks neutral, but it is actually one of the most misleading labels in human origins genetics, because it defines most of humanity using a negative category and smuggles in a whole evolutionary story that the data does not support. The deeper implication is even more destabilizing. For Basal Eurasians to have no Neanderthal ancestry, one of two things must be true. Either they split off from other Eurasian populations before the main Neanderthal admixture event, or they were geographically situated somewhere that avoided it entirely, perhaps southern Arabia, the Persian Gulf, Egypt, or Mediterranean Africa. One thing is for certain, they did not migrate from sub-Saharan Africa. In any case, the Basal Eurasian story implies that the classic narrative, one migration out of Africa, then one Neanderthal admixture, then diversification, was always wrong. And this is where the scientific debate reveals itself not as a polite disagreement, but as a tense struggle over what humans are allowed to be. Dr. Lazaridis publicly rebuked the claim that all pre-50,000-year Eurasian populations died out when this claim was promoted by a certain well-known British out-of-Africa theorist. According to Lazaridis, the inference does not follow. Present-day West Eurasians and ancient Near Easterners carry Basal Eurasian ancestry that would itself dilute later Neanderthal admixture, meaning deep pre-50,000-year structure must be taken seriously. The British paleoanthropologist replied in a way that reads almost like a defensive reflex, yes, Basal Eurasians contribute, but were they out of Africa? That question, innocent on its face, is actually the whole ideological battlefield, because if Basal Eurasians can be forced back into out of Africa, then the narrative survives. The story can be repaired. Basal Eurasians are just another African-derived branch, still part of the Grand African Exodus, still consistent with the idea that Eurasia was populated only after the final successful departure. But if Basal Eurasians represent a deep West Eurasian lineage with real long-term continuity, then out-of-Africa replacement stops being the master key to everything. So Basal Eurasian becomes not just a genetic component, but a philosophical irritant. It makes a mockery of the phrase no contribution from early Eurasian humans. It demands that we treat West Eurasia not as an empty theatre waiting for 50,000-year arrivals, but as a long-lived, structured habitat where Homo sapiens lineages diverged, persisted, mixed and reshaped one another over immense spans of time. That is the real reason this matters. Basal Eurasian ancestry does not simply add another arrow on the diagram. It tells us that European ancestry includes a deep root that does not fit the simplistic modern myth of late arrival. What does this mean for the identity of Europeans? It means Europeans are not merely the descendants of the last migration wave. Europeans are the inheritors of a deep Near Eastern genetic history, and that Near Eastern history itself is not a short post-50,000 year chapter, but plausibly a 100,000-year story, a story of survival across ice ages, deserts, and shifting ecologies. It means European identity is not the genetic equivalent of a recent colonial settlement, but of a continent linked to a much older West Eurasian homeland, perhaps an ancient refugium in Arabia, North Africa, or the greater Near East that fed ancestry into later farming populations and then into Europe itself. It also means Europe is not a clean hunter-farmer steppe sandwich. The European farmers who arrived around 7000 BC were not just agricultural migrants, they were carriers of deep history. The papers describe early European farmers as deriving from Anatolian Neolithic farmers who largely derived from local Anatolian hunter-gatherers with additional inputs and who moved into Europe via southeast corridors. But what gets lost in the simplified telling is that inside those farmers was Basal Eurasian ancestry, which means the Neolithic transition was not merely a cultural revolution, it was a demographic injection of ancient ancestry. The farmers did not just bring wheat and goats, they brought a ghost lineage that split before Eurasians split. That is the kind of sentence that should be printed in bold on museum walls. Yet it isn't. The irony is that Basal Eurasian is actually a more interesting story than the simplified replacement myth. It suggests that West Eurasia, the Near East especially, was not just a corridor, but a reservoir. Not just a hallway between Africa and Europe, but a deep ancestral storehouse. It implies that the Near East was not simply colonized once by modern humans and then used as a staging ground, but occupied repeatedly, continuously, and structurally enough to generate deep divergence. This matters because it reframes the "who are Europeans" question in a way that Europeans rarely confront. European ancestry is not only European, it is profoundly West Eurasian, Near Eastern, deeply tied to refugia, and branches that were already ancient before Europe was peopled in anything like its modern form. Basal Eurasian ancestry is not an exotic addition from the Near East. It is a foundational contributor to Europeans, especially via the very farmers who set the demographic and genetic foundation of much of later Europe. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect is this: Basal Eurasian is not yet a fossil. We do not have a Basal Eurasian skeleton to reconstruct. We do not have the thrill of "here is the first Basal Eurasian skull." What we have is something more abstract and therefore easier to ignore, a statistical shadow in the data. A deep divergence inferred from patterns of allele sharing, admixture modeling, and how populations relate across time, which allows the psychological defense mechanism to remain in place. If it does not have a fossil, perhaps it can remain a footnote. However, history does not care about our storytelling needs. The genetic data keep dragging us back. Basal Eurasians are described as potentially emerging around 100,000 years ago, and having one defining difference from other Eurasians, not carrying recent Neanderthal DNA. Other cited works suggest divergence in the broad range of 60,000 to 100,000 years ago, or different model estimates, but the core point remains. Basal Eurasian implies deep time depth and survival of ancestry streams that break the simple timeline. This is why Basal Eurasian is not merely another ancestry category. It is a forensic clue that invalidates the clean conclusion some want, that all early Eurasian Homo sapiens were evolutionary dead ends. The very existence of Basal Eurasian ancestry in Europeans makes that claim intellectually untenable. And that is why Dr. Lazaridis can insist correctly that the inference pre-50,000-year populations died out does not follow. So what should we say plainly if we were honest? We should say this: Europeans are partly descended from a deep Eurasian lineage that split early, survived long, and fed heavily into the Near Eastern farmers who later reshaped Europe. Europeans are not simply modern humans who arrived at 45,000 years ago. They are a layered composite of ancestries, including one that carries a deeper West Eurasian history than the popular story allows. In that sense, Europeans are not late arrivals. They are filtered survivors of a West Eurasian system that was already ancient. And once you say that, you cannot go back to the old version of Out of Africa, because the problem is this. If Basal Eurasians were already in regions we suspect, including Egypt or Arabia, then how could a population migrate right through the middle of these regions without mixing with the Basal Eurasians? It is impossible. So Europeans are not a single branch with a 2% Neanderthal souvenir. They are the product of an older, more tangled West Eurasian inheritance, an ancestry archive where parts of the story are still missing, still unsampled, still waiting for the bones to catch up with the DNA. Basal Eurasian is the chapter Europe forgot. But now that it has been found, it cannot be unfound. Thanks for watching.